Hey everyone, my name's Kabir,
I'm Ben.
and welcome to Mind Matters. Today, we're recording our 9th episode on eating disorders. Eating disorders are some of the most stigmatized, misunderstood, and mishandled mental health challenges in our society, and they affect both teens and adults. Ben, would you like to go ahead and read our mission statement for today?
Yeah, we read this mission statement at the beginning of every episode to let you know what the goal of the episode is. Depression, anxiety, or that uneasy, empty, or lonely feeling inside of you is very common and normal amongst high schoolers, but it is not talked about. The goal of this show is to make you feel like your experiences are normal and recognized. We also will give you practical solutions to improve your life. Mind Matters is the only podcast that talks about those ugly feelings from a high school perspective.
Absolutely. And just remember, the goal of this show is really to start conversations. By talking about these things, we are trying to encourage our audience to find a way to discuss these things with the people around them and help people in the process, right? By raising awareness on this show, we are bringing these topics into the public view, into the mainstream. And yes, that is the main goal here. So I'd like to start off with some definitions. Obviously, eating disorders are extremely prevalent in our society, whether or not, we acknowledge them. Obviously, the stigma is unbelievable surrounding things like body dysmorphia and, eating disorders in general. So, Ben, would you like to start off with the definition that you have for this topic?
Yeah, and I think it's important that you raise that eating disorders not only being the most stigmatized, but the most misunderstood and mishandled, right?
Mhm.
There's this huge population of people that are affected by eating disorders, and you may not see them because maybe you think eating disorders only affect people who on extreme ends, like who don't eat enough or eat way, way too much, but people who appear normal at like a normal weight. A lot of these people are affected by eating disorders as well. So it's very misunderstood. So it's important that we start with definitions and types to kind of start raising awareness. So according to psychiatry.org, eating disorders are behavioral conditions characterized by severe and persistent disturbance in eating behaviors and associated distressing thoughts and emotions. So I think many people think of eating disorders, right, as disturbance in eating behaviors. That's kind of definitionally, right, what it is and what people think about, rightly so, but people maybe don't often think about the associated distressing thoughts and emotions as well, which we'll cover later.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of key facts here. Eating disorders, severe eating disorders, affect up to 5% of the population, so 1 in 20 people. So there's a very, very high chance that someone's close to you, right? Someone close to you has a severe eating disorder and is affected by that, and you may not even know it because it's not obvious, and people try very much to hide it because it's one of the most stigmatized and misunderstood, as I said, and frowned upon. Whenever I say the word disease, I worry that it has the wrong connotation, but I really mean caused by scientific reasons, which we'll discuss later. So it's one of the most prevalent diseases.
Absolutely. And I really like the fact that you integrated the idea of eating disorders with, the associated mental health challenges that come with it. Obviously, our podcast is about mental health. So, talking about, the immense stress and, a lot of the worry that comes from having an unhealthy relationship with food, whether that's eating, relatively too much or too little, although those are obviously very stigma heavy, terms to use in the first place, which, it goes to show that the stigma around eating disorders is prevalent at all levels of our society, right? Even starting with, our primary, socialization with parents and family, right? When's the last time, like, I know for me, my grandmother used to comment all the time about how skinny I was, about how I wasn't eating enough. And, hearing that stuff as a child, it seems innocuous enough until you get to an age where you can process things at a deeper level. And then you think like, oh, why is she talking about my body this way? And the reason why it's such a pervasive and, kind of malignant thing, the stigma around eating disorders, is because often people like your grandmother, they obviously don't mean to harm you, right? They don't want to hurt your emotional, your mental health, but their negative commentary just has that effect regardless of their intent. And so that just shapes your relationship, and it warps your relationship with food to an unhealthy extent. At least it did in my life. And, coming from an Indian background where, food is considered something like it's a delicacy to, everyone in the family, and the grandmother in particular has a particular role in that. So, that negative commentary is just bound to affect your relationship.
Yeah, it's interesting how you bring up these things that happen as a kid, and you may think it's innocuous, as you said, but there's a connection being established between kind of the person's perception of body or things like that with food, right? Just from a very, very early age. So that kind of unhealthy connection is established and leads to things like, and we'll finish off the definition section here to kind of give you some ideas of how people are struggling. So obviously we talk about eating disorders being on opposite ends of the spectrum, but there are some intermediate ones I'll talk about, but I'll first start with the other ones. Anorexia nervosa is characterized by self-starvation and weight loss. Some intermediate ones, individuals with bulimia nervosa typically alternate dieting by eating low-calorie foods and then binge eating. And then people on the other end, people who suffer from binge eating disorder have episodes of binge eating in which they consume obviously large quantities of food in a brief period. And these are all caused in main part by scientific factors and not lifestyle choices, which kind of leads us into the stigma, misunderstanding, and counterproductive rhetoric section of this episode, where we kind of talk about why do people stigmatize eating disorders so much? Why can't people seem to understand that their rhetoric and their comments are so harmful? And why are they so harmful? And later we'll talk about what we can do to fix it.
Right. I love the fact that you bring up all of, the scientific causes behind this, and you're emphasizing that it's not based on your lifestyle much, like a lot of the time. And, the sheer number of types of eating disorders you brought up testifies to like the fact that this is an all-pervasive issue, and your emphasis on the scientific parts, like it shows that people, the disconnect between the actual root causes of eating disorders and the societal, condemnation of them, right? So you have people, who aren't dealing with these disorders thinking that it's just because people can't, they can't handle themselves, they can't control themselves, or they're just purposely starving themselves. But in reality, right, there's a lot of, genetic, environmental factors that play into that. And purely from a biological perspective, a lot of our society is unable to reconcile, negative opinions with, the actual science. And I think it's extremely important that as advocates for mental health, we promote the idea of, recognizing the science behind it, and, moving away from these like kind of regressive thought patterns about, oh, it's just your choice, you're not making a good choice. And, I just want to tie this into social media because,
As a lot of
oftentimes,
things we tie
of
into a
course,
lot,
of
social
course.
media.
Yeah, like online. If you see a video of someone who perhaps doesn't fit, society's definition of, conventionally fit, right? Or just fit in general. People in the comments, traditionally on platforms like Instagram, they often just eviscerate the person in the video. They just subject them to an endless, stream of critiques about how they're making the wrong choices with their body. Like, have you seen that guy, Nick Ocado?
No, I haven't.
Okay,
No.
he's this guy on multiple platforms, but people often just bully him about his body, right? And, regardless of whether that's a choice he made or not, like, the fact is, we live in a very fat phobic and dismissive society towards people who kind of deal
And
with
on
these
the other
problems.
end of the
Yeah, of
spectrum
course.
too,
With when you're undereating, or as you phrased it, self-starving. Of
Mhm.
course, that phrase has a very negative connotation, but when we think about people who suffer from that, it's very, very prevalent. And every time you look in the mirror, it's inevitable that you're going to find something about your body that you don't find that you're not pleased about, right? And I think all of us have dealt to that with that to some extent, but for people who actually suffer from these eating disorders, it can be so socially limiting to have to deal with them because people just don't recognize the severity of them and just think it's like normal body image issues when in reality it's much deeper than that.
Yeah, it's interesting how you bring up the comment section of the person you were talking about, right?
Hmm.
Because those are people, and this is going to sound crazy, but I think in some ways that's actually, you're not going to believe this, that's actually less harmful to a person than somebody close to them making passive aggressive or backhanded comments that
Yeah,
kind of,
that makes sense.
subvert their struggle, or like, for example, if somebody is like binge eating at a family event, and some family member makes like some side comment like about, you like binge eating or eating a lot, like, oh, like have enough there, or something like that, that kind of like not even not directly addresses what's going on in kind of a backhanded way, and that kind of creates a detachment, I think, from people and their loved ones, and the medium for that is this eating disorder, right? That's
Hmm.
caused by scientific causes, but people think obviously that it's such a choice.
Yeah, it absolutely. The fact that people in your life will make these backhanded comments. I've seen that a lot, other people, but also, myself. And I'm sure that maybe you've had some of this similar experiences, but or maybe not. I'm not sure. Do you have any experiences
Yeah,
like that?
definitely. I think in binge eating, I think we all struggle in just in some
Mm-hmm.
ways, right?
Yeah.
But I think binge eating definitely, right? And people, as I'm sure many, I think 5% is like under characterizing, right? And it's hard to tell like what eating disorder. I said, binge eating is something I've experienced at some points, but it's hard to tell how extreme it is because nobody talks about it. There's
Mm-hmm.
no conversation going on, which is so debilitating to the people who are really, really struggling.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
I can say that, when people make backhanded comments, and they do, people always find ways to put other people's down.
Of
It's
course.
what
Yeah.
they're very, very good at.
Yeah.
Um, but it causes like distressing thoughts and emotions. Like I'm at an event and that happens, like I feel so uncomfortable and out of place and like so detached, and it's really, really hard. And I think that happens if you're somebody who's listening, who's struggling with this, that happens to so many people. And so many people struggle with it and have that kind of not necessarily body dysmorphia, but discomfort when those things happen, and feel like they're alone, but you're
Yeah.
not. You're
Exactly.
absolutely not
Of course.
alone. It's
Of course. Yeah.
it's 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 so unfortunate that people continue with this counterproductive rhetoric, but you are not alone at all.
Right. Like on TikTok too, I've seen so many posts of people, kind of lamenting that their families are criticizing their eating habits, right? Thousands of posts I've seen of with this topic in mind. And even in my personal life, even apart from the family at school, this negative behavior manifests at its worst and most malignant sometimes, right? Like people, even some of my friends actually in class, I'll mention, they ask me, "Oh, Kabir, how much do you weigh?" And I don't I'll maybe I'll give them the exact figure, sometimes I don't, but either way they're like, "Oh, you're so skinny, like are you kidding me? You would fall apart, you're like a twig." And like comments like that have encouraged me to start wearing a lot more like thick outerwear, like jackets and stuff, because that kind of conceals my body, right? It makes me feel, it gives me like this protective shell kind of to hide away, people perceiving my body as too skinny. And right, I would even say like maybe I do have an unhealthy relationship with food. Like I probably don't eat enough, but the fact that it's so normalized to comment on these things in a public setting, like people just feel like they can get away with saying, "Oh, you're so skinny. How you should eat more. Oh, you should start going to the gym. Oh, you should do all this." And of course, physical activity is a great thing, but it definitely should not be so normalized to be making comments like that about other people's bodies. And not only is that debilitating because it causes you to form negative habits over time, right? Like this preoccupation with wearing like jackets to make it seem like I have a more filled out frame, I guess. But also like you go to comments and a lot of the people there will just be like, oh, what were you thinking posting this video? You're not making the right choice for your body. And the creator is just left with a lot of, negativity, even though that may have not even been the point of the video. It's just it's such a malignant like disease, as you kind of phrased it at the beginning, that, pervades all of our society.
Yeah, it's disgusting, really, that happens all the time, right? But I also think you said tied back to social media, right? In this age of kind of um, performative, um, attempts to gain popularity, right? That kind of body dysmorphia is perpetuated because the people on TikTok who get the most, positive comments and things like that tend to be the people who are perceived as, um, as as condonable in a way by society standards of
Yeah.
body image, right?
Right.
So I think social media is a huge factor that perpetuates this stigma, right? And it's something to really consider when you're on the platform as well. And also consider, if you're someone who's a victim, that a lot of these things, although they're being perpetuated by social media, maybe they're not as real because more people struggle with them. Obviously, we talk about people on social media kind of putting out fake personas, right?
Right. No, the performativity
Yeah,
of
it's all performative, right? And yeah, I think it is all performative, right? So you have to kind of keep in mind that it may not be as rare,
right.
right,
Yeah, yeah,
as
yeah.
you may think.
Like the 1 in 20 statistic, or like the
I
5%.
think it's low.
Yeah, it's low. It's definitely a low ball, because you consider like the number of people who have just been kind of brainwashed into thinking that, or into like ignoring their problems and stuff. So like when they do these studies, a lot of the times they're not even going to report that, right?
We'll even say, we can be transparent about this. As mental health podcasters, we have a conversation before this episode, maybe that we haven't even had before any other episode. Like, oh, do we really want to talk about like this? Like,
Yeah.
it's so stigmatized
Of
that
course.
even us, right,
Right.
who really are very comfortable being vulnerable to make people feel that like they're not alone. It was hard to do, right? And
Right.
it is hard to do right now.
Yeah.
So,
I think the reason for that is actually just because of how vulnerable a lot of the people suffering from these conditions are right now. It's extremely important to like select the right words when talking about this stuff, because everything matters, right? At a stage of like, this isn't like mental health in general, where like, of course it's stigmatized, but eating disorders in particular are so much more stigmatized in a way that, every single word matters, in a way that like when you're advocating for like awareness about this stuff, you need to be a lot more careful, which is why, as you were mentioning, we had a conversation about, are we even qualified to talk about this, right?
mhm.
There is an inherent, worry that we might misrepresent something, which of course we don't want to do, but because this is so like not often talked about, it might be difficult for like to even express ourselves in a way that's completely accurate, right?
Mhm. So I think at this point, right, we've talked about what eating disorders are, why they're, so stigmatized, why they're so misunderstood. But I think part of the misunderstanding is that, and we've alluded to this multiple times in the episode, is that they're caused by pure, in a large part, scientific factors, right? It's
Yeah.
it's physiological, and it's not a lifestyle choice in large part. I'm not
Right.
saying that
Right.
like you can't control some things. Obviously, everybody has some choice, but I'm saying that in the long run, over time, decisions are caused by these physiological factors. So, Kabir, our science genius, right, on this podcast,
Mhm.
do you want to talk about some of the scientific causes?
Oh, yes, of course. So we see that like a lot of the time, eating disorders are caused by disturbances in the gut microbiome, like diabetes, early puberty have often been shown to like increase the development of an eating disorder. Also, like some EDs have like a lot to do with brain plasticity. Right. They often have like an extremely disproportionate effect on younger people. Um, largely because of the development of the brain, right? Like as a young person, your
Yes,
brain is
yeah.
still developing. It's vulnerable to being trapped in like a positive feedback loop. You continue to fuel the ED, whereas like an adult, as once the frontal lobe, once all of these parts of the brain fully develop, it's probably easier to regulate that than for a young mind who's being fed all of these negative comments or like societal expectations of being fit or a body image, right? All of those things have a disproportionate effect on a developing brain. And also, we see that people who suffer from trauma, anxiety, OCD, and depression often show higher levels of susceptibility to eating disorders.
Yeah.
Which, of course, as we suffer from
Yeah,
these conditions
just
ourselves.
to give you
So,
some statistics, right, to kind of show you the correlation. So, this is according to some psychiatric sources, right? Up to 70% of anorexic individuals exhibit characteristics of perfectionism, right?
mhm.
Oftentimes, characteristics of perfectionism are also associated with diseases and mental health struggles like OCD and other things, right?
Yeah,
Um, 50 to 75% of eating disorder patients also have a severe anxiety disorder.
of course. And I think
Obviously,
as would you like, I mean, we both
have
have,
severe
yeah, yeah,
anxiety,
yeah.
yeah. But
And
I'm saying, like, not 75% of people don't have a severe anxiety disorder, but
mhm,
75% of people with eating disorders do. So
right.
obviously there's a high correlation there. And about 30% of eating disorder cases have been linked to childhood abuse or neglect as well. Um, and lastly, abnormal levels of serotonin, a purely physiological factor in the human body, has been found in 60 to 70% of patients with anorexia and bulimia.
Absolutely, disarming. The numbers here are absolutely indicative of a larger
Yeah.
problem. And, the fact
It's
that,
an indictment to the general rhetoric going around
right,
that eating disorders are this
you
this
know,
pure choice.
influenced by decisions in your
Yeah.
lifestyle, right? Of course, there's a disproportionate, like, there's a disconnect between the amount that this stuff is talked about and like the sheer effect it has on people, right? So, like as you said, um, you know, even though 5% might seem like a small amount, it's really not when you
No.
consider that that's probably a low
There's
estimate
like a
anyway.
99% chance, maybe even higher, that somebody close to you or relatively close to you suffers from something like this,
Right.
right? So suffers from an eating disorder. So there
Yeah.
is a lot you can do to make their life better.
Absolutely. And to talk about that, right? Like I bet if you ask some of the people in my class who don't know me very well, they wouldn't think that I have an eating disorder or even that I suffer from body dysmorphia because I do so much to cover it up, right? After years of negative commentary, even, benign commentary, I get those kinds of people. You wouldn't expect that from someone, I guess, who doesn't talk about it very much. But the reality is, like, if I told some of these people that I have an unhealthy relationship with food, it would come as a shock, I think, to a lot of people because you just don't have that experience and it's not talked about. Right, mental health even has less stigma. So, like the topic of mental health in general has less stigma than this in particular, right? Because this has this because eating disorders have this like extremely negative connotation of being, purely based on lifestyle factors. When mental health may, as a whole, maybe doesn't have that same association.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I definitely have suffered with binge eating disorder, and in some ways, or in that way, I would say I definitely have an unhealthy relationship with food in that way, and I've experienced backhanded comments like that earlier in my life, like you did, and
Hmm.
also later with some of the binge eating stuff, right? And obviously, I don't think at least nobody would look at us and think, oh, that person has an eating disorder, right?
Right.
But, it happens, and that goes to show how common it is, right? It's very common. So
Yeah.
you're Kabir. I just want to make a message kind of to you and to the listener as well that you're understood, you're heard, and it's admirable that you talk about it so openly and with such courage to kind
Thank
of
you.
help the
Yeah.
listener, right?
hmm
So
Obviously, yeah, this is just about becoming more open, and the way
it's an
that you say,
uncomfortable
yeah,
conversation.
of course, it's being very vulnerable. But something you said reminded me a lot about how the mind plays tricks on you, right? So you said that if you look at someone who has an eating disorder, a lot of the time you won't be able to tell,
Yeah.
right? And that goes to show that you know. Eating disorders and body dysmorphia are often really tied together, right? Like when you look in the mirror and you see that you're too skinny, or that you see that you know, you're putting on weight, supposedly, right? That's oftentimes the mind, convincing you of that, when in reality, like, other people can't see it. So it's it's just such an awful thing, because, you know, the changes that you as in your mind is perceiving, they're not even visible to other people a lot of the time. And so there's this like internal dilemma of like, how do I deal with something that, is eating me up from the inside, but other people can't seem to even notice, right? And it can be frustrating. Like, oftentimes I've noticed, oh, I'm getting too like I've had just like problems with my mind, focusing on issues with my body, and I ask other people, and they can't even tell that that's going on, right? So it's frustrating, because you think it's such a huge thing when you look in the mirror and you see that, but people around you don't.
Yeah, that's so true. And um this kind of leads into our last segment, right? About how can we make it better for people? How can we make people, how can we make you feel like you're understood? How can we be supportive and not passive aggressive? How can we improve conditions in society to make recovery from eating disorder more attainable? So, I think the first thing, right, on a daily basis, right? We have to kind of be more aware and stop making passive aggressive comments about people's bodies or eating habits. That even though, because another way you bring this up, another way that people's mind play tricks on them is they make a passive aggressive comment, but in their mind, they think it's like a playful joke or something
Oh
even
yeah,
nice
yeah,
to
yeah,
say.
yeah,
Your
definitely.
mind plays tricks
Right.
on you in that way. So I think trying to be more aware of that. Kabir, do you have any examples of passive aggressive phrases or things of that nature that
Oh,
people should look out for?
definitely. Like, I think I mentioned this before too. Like, people saying that, oh, you look like a twig, or even the opposite end. Oh, you're putting on some weight. Like, you should go to the gym or something like that. Stuff like that. They think it's either they're joking or they genuinely mean it, and they genuinely think that they're helping you, right? But oftentimes, or I think even most of the time, what they say isn't stuff that you don't know, right? It's stuff that other people have told you even. So like, by saying that, by having like the nerve to go and say that to someone, right? To disrespect them in that way, even if you don't think it's disrespectful, it's really just compounding the issue, because it's not like that's completely new, revelatory information, right? It's really just making the problem even worse for the person dealing with it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think comments can be even more subtle and more passive aggressive. And I say this because in those ones can be even more destructive, because if someone says to you, "Oh, you look like a twig," it's pretty clear what they mean, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
of course.
So, but if someone makes a passive aggressive comment, or like, "Are you sure you've had enough?" And they keep on
Mhm.
repeating that. You
Yes,
sort of kinda,
yes,
like,
yes, yeah.
question what they're implicating, and then you start to question
Right,
what's going on, you question your whole it plays into social
right.
anxiety, or they'll be like, or they'll say it, um, like, in another way, like, um, "Oh, like, wow, you've had a lot," or, like, something
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
and that
Like,
kind of
something
right,
so subtle
right, right,
that causes such
and that kind
immense
of
destruction.
right, like, that goes to show there's kind of a difference here between, like, the benign comments and the jokes, like, the "you look like a twig" one, obviously, that's not the kindest thing to say, but when you say, "Oh, have you had enough?" That's obviously that I mean, sometimes that might be a joke, but a lot of the time, it might be said by someone who genuinely wants to know if
Mhm.
you wanna eat more, right? Or someone who genuinely thinks that, like, what I'm trying to say is like sometimes it's benign, sometimes it's malicious, but either way, it's destructive, right? Either
Exactly.
way, it tears you down as a person, and what makes this such
Like,
a
if somebody doesn't think they've had enough, and I'll say this too, sometimes people don't feel they've had enough, but they'll think they'll be judged for, like, going to get more because they're worried about what people will have to say. Like,
right,
it's this
right,
vortex of just craziness that's going on that's causing so much destruction. And if this is such a far reach and it'll take so much effort, but if people didn't think that way, life would be a lot better, I think. And people, like, if that didn't happen, if you wanted more, are you sure you've had enough? You would go and get more without them
right,
asking you, right?
absolutely,
Like,
yeah.
you don't need to ask me if I want more. I'll go and get more.
Yes, no,
But now maybe people don't because they're fearful of being judged because they're asking to get more.
exactly.
So
No,
it's
it's
this.
a
It's
vortex, as you
yeah.
said.
It's a
That's good. Right,
it's such a destructive societal kind of system from the higher levels, social media, promoting body dysphoria, to lower level, all the way to lower level, these daily passive aggressive and very destructive comments that that really make people question their social surroundings and situations.
absolutely, right. And going like talking about social environments and social situations, I think one of the biggest parts of our podcast is addressing solutions, right?
Yeah.
And there's the general advice that we can give
Yeah,
out,
it's
right?
just
Like,
raise awareness. I
yeah,
can't, we
like,
can't say like, "Oh, go and don't say this." It's not going to be 100% fixed overnight. But if we
right,
start having more of these conversations, right, which is so hard to do. I don't see so much about eating. I see a lot of things about anxiety, depression. I don't see so much about eating disorders because nobody wants to talk
right.
about it.
And it's
We're
like,
willing to talk about it because you, the
yeah,
person listening, you're not at a social event right now. You don't have to, go, but we want you to know that you are heard. It's totally normal. And a lot of these people probably are suffering from the same things.
right. And the thing is, it's so normalized to make comments, but so not normalized to talk about how those comments affect you or to talk about the eating disorders themselves. And so the biggest thing about raising awareness is just making sure is just bringing our society to a point where people, instead of getting made fun of instead of getting praised or like getting normalized for saying like mean things, they get criticized for that, right? Like if you say something racist, obviously you're going to get a lot of backlash. But if you make comments like this, a lot of the times people will think it's justified. We as a society, and what we're trying to do here is get ourselves to a point where issues like this or making comments about people's bodies is seen as like a sensitive issue in the same way like sexism or racism, stuff like that, stuff that people obviously call out as being terrible things to say, right? But people don't call this stuff out, right? People don't call out comments about your body. They don't say, oh, why are you talking about their body that way? Oftentimes it's just silence, right?
Yeah.
People are just silent. And so, right, I guess there's something to be said about how you need to, like, I guess, advocate for the person who's being shamed in that way.
Yes. So, um, I think that covers, right, what we were going to talk about today, right, with eating
Yeah,
disorders. This was, I'm not gonna lie, it's an uncomfortable conversation. It's a
absolutely,
difficult
right.
conversation. Um,
And as
and
we said,
yeah.
like, it's hard to know if we're even qualified to talk
Yeah,
about
it's hard
this,
to know,
right?
but we want to
It's
raise
hard.
awareness and we want to make you feel like your struggles with potentially an eating disorder and some of the accompanying struggles like anxiety, social phobias, and other things are completely normal and recognized. So I think that kind of
Mhm.
covers what we were going to talk about
Yeah.
today. I can't believe we haven't mentioned this until the end of the episode, but Ethan did not grace us with his
Oh,
presence
yeah,
today. He
mhm.
is in Japan,
Right.
right? So he'll be back soon. He'll be in the next episode. But yeah, what's the outro he always does? He's
Oh,
better at
yeah,
it, right?
right? My name's Kabir,
I'm Ben, and just
and
remember,
your mind matters.